Doctors who have been in, and is anybody here a doctor situation? What happened? My wife and I were waiting for a plane to take off, and they asked for a doc over the intercom. My wife got up and there was a guy lying in the aisle, already dead. She couldn't do anything, had to sign some forms. They got the guy off the plane, and made an announcement that the guy was in stable condition, which is technically true for some definition of the word stable. I'm currently a first-year resident, internal medicine in Sweden. This happened last year, about a year after I graduated, so I was still relatively fresh out of med school. I was flying home from my vacation from the Mediterranean, a 3-hour flight, when they announced on the speaker system that they were looking for a healthcare professional. Stood up when they called out a second time, maybe 15 seconds later. It was me and a bit older nurse who went up to the front rows where a middle-aged male was awake but unresponsive. As I didn't really have a lot of experience and was somewhat panicing, kept the panic internally to myself. It's scary being alone. I fell back to ATLS, and eventually noticed that I had a D problem. Decreased strength in one of his arms and one-sided facial droop that was quite mild. Long story short, I suspected a stroke but couldn't really do a whole lot. We were 30 minutes away from landing at the time of the initial call. They didn't deviate or anything. I didn't feel like I did that much, to be honest, except say that I suspected a stroke, and asked if they could call an ambulance to the airport. The airplane seemed to land a bit faster than it usually does, and as we went off the runway, there was an ambulance waiting off the taxiway. When the ambulance staff boarded the plane, I gave a short report, and that's basically it. I got a thank you from the relatives and the stewardesses. They asked me to write down my name and email, but I haven't heard anything since. Recently, before the coronavirus, I was taking an international flight. The flight attendant asked on if there was a doctor aboard. I was actually asleep, but somehow that woke me up. And I was like, wait, you need a doctor. Turns out a patient was experiencing some diffuse chest pain. Went to examine him and my inner alarm bells rang when I asked him some questions. I had a very high suspicion that this guy was having an aortic dissection. I told the flight attendant, who passed on the information to the pilot. The pilot made an emergency landing at a different airport, met with an ambulance. I later called the hospital to find out what exactly it was, and turns out I was right. If they had carried on, he might not have survived. Not a doctor, but story is still relevant in an opposite sort of way. Was watching a children's soccer game. Two 11-year-old girls collided. One got up and her arm was hanging 90 degrees down halfway between her wrist and her elbow. It's not supposed to do that. She continued to play for a second, and then realized what her arm was doing. She totally bugged out. She started screaming, "I think something is wrong here." All of the parents are yelling at the girl to take a knee and the ref to stop the game. I jumped the fence with another parent. We get her to sit on her knee and rest her broken arm against the bent knee. I yell out, "Where's her parents?" Nothing. "Is anyone here a doctor?" Nothing. At this point it's been like 2 minutes since the original and obvious break. I take my phone out to call 911. 911, hi, what's your emergency? Me, I'm sure you've gotten multiple calls by now, but I just want to make sure. We've got a girl with broken arm here. Has anyone called for an ambulance? 911, no one has called. Where are you located? There had to be 500 people watching this game. It was a regional tournament. No doctor. No parent. No one had called 911. About 10 minutes later the ambulance arrived. Mother arrived at the same time. She had to park a mile away, big tournament, and just finally made it back to the game. Girl gets carted away. The remaining girls somewhat finished the game that had been shortened by 30 minutes due to this incident. Finally the next game starts and I take my seat on the sidelines next to some random parent. Her husband comes up next to us a few minutes later, and she turns to him and says, "You missed all of the action." This man, pointing to me, had to help a girl who broke her arm. Really? He says, "That's too bad, I probably could have helped." I turn to him and ask him why that is. "Are you a doctor?" "Yes," he says. "I'm a pediatric orthopedic surgeon." For fuck's sake. The first doctor to show up when it's too late is the most qualified doctor. I just stared at him for a few seconds, mouth agape. He looked at me sheepishly and just said, "I know, right? Don't feel bad, you probably did the same thing I would have done, but I would have known it was the right thing to do." Lesson of the day, the more people around, the more likely that everyone assumes someone else had called 911. The woman was shopping at the grocery store I worked at, with her car parked out front, with her husband in the car, listening to the radio. She went out, couldn't wake him, and came inside asking for a doctor. There wasn't one, but I knew CPR. I performed it until the EMTs showed up, and he was pronounced dead at the hospital. Never saw the woman again, which is unfortunate, because she was definitely a regular, and very pleasant. It probably took a good 5 years before I was able to convince myself that him dying wasn't on me. It was a lot of, what if I wasn't doing it right? Did I miss a step? Was I rushing? before I allowed myself to believe that I truly performed my best, that I was likely doing it right, as I did have quite a lot of repeated trainings. My dad was a fireman and I was a Red Cross certified babysitter, and had to have yearly CPR refresher certifications, and that he just wasn't meant to make it. I have a doctorate, but I am not a medical doctor. But shortly after receiving my doctorate, I was on a transatlantic flight, and the flight attendant came around asking if any one of us was a doctor. I, very briefly, considered answering jokingly yes, but not that kind of doctor. But the man in front of me said that he was, and as he was leaving with the attendant, he said to his wife, "I've been waiting my whole career for this." About 15 minutes later he came back, slightly disgruntled. Turned out a woman in first class was having a panic attack, and she ended up with 3 doctors around her, all frustrated that they didn't get to do an emergency tracheotomy at 35,000 feet. My father, doctor, 30 years ago was sent to work in southern Italy, although he already lived with my mother in the north, and a large part of the salary ended up in tickets to return by plane every weekend. The fact is that during the flight to the south, lasting about 1 hour, they do not give anything to eat, except they pass with a trolley to give candies. Needless to say, the classic situation of the old woman who chokes on it and cannot breathe. My dad was called, and with a few heavy blows on the back, he managed to get the candy out of the poor old woman. A week goes by, and the day of the return on the plane comes. The trolley with the candies passes promptly, and out of nowhere a girl sitting in front of my father who was trying to get one is blocked by her friend. "Don't take it. Last week they told me that an old woman got choked up, and to free her, doctor had to slap her really hard on the back." Not in the medical profession, but from my time in the military, I knew basic life-saving techniques like CPR, and what to do when someone is drowning. My story involved my son when he was 6 years old. We were in town for my father's funeral. That night at the hotel, the kids were in the pool. It was packed. He was swimming in the shallow end. Next thing I know, a girl is holding him saying, "I think he's drowning." I pulled him from the pool, asked if he could breathe. He shook his head no. I laid him down, rolled him to his side and hit his back. He started throwing up lungfuls of water. Finally he says he can breathe. My wife is freaking out and he is white as a ghost. He threw up probably 4 to 5 times. Worst part is when I pulled him from the pool, my first thought is I'm gonna watch home die. My wife said I reacted so fast that I had H out of the pool before she realized what was happening. I almost lost my composure when he looked at me and said, "Thanks for saving me, Dad." I recommend, if you can, to take some basic life savings classes. Happened a few years ago. My family works in healthcare, in non-medical capacities, but as a part of jobs we're given CPR training, and basic first aid skills from giving stitches to blood pressure readings, etc. It was shortly before Christmas. We were at home, and suddenly there's this massive pounding at our back door, and it's one of the neighbors in a panic, and said a guy collapsed. "We need your help." So my brother, father and I sprung into gear. My dad flew out the door without even a JACKET. December in Canada. I got on the phone with 911, and my brother went with my dad to assist. Our neighbors were walking to the post box, and suddenly the hubby collapsed. Massive heart attack. The other neighbor and wife panicked and tried loading him into the back seat of the car, instead of calling 911. Then the wife said, "Go to that house. They work in a hospital," which was our house. So my dad was on the gentleman giving full-blown CPR for at least 5 straight minutes, till the paramedics EMTs arrived. My dad was exhausted and extremely sweaty. Fortunately, paramedics were able to bring him back, but he passed away a few days later in the ICU, as too much damage was dealt. However, we learned his family were around him and were able to say goodbye when he passed. The paramedics told my dad that his actions allowed them to bring him back and allowed them to try and save him. Also breaking 4 ribs. Doing CPR will most likely break ribs. On Christmas Eve, my dad was in our backyard have a smoke, and he heard a group of about 30 carolers singing to the widow Christmas carols. It was beautiful. I'm not a doctor, but I'm a nurse. Just yesterday morning, I heard these women screaming in the hallway of my hotel, "We need help. Does anyone know CPR?" I ran out the door and told these women I was a nurse. They took me to the front lobby where they found a young woman who seemed to have overdosed. She wasn't breathing, but she had a pulse at first. It started to get weaker, then stopped altogether. I had to do 4 rounds of CPR before I felt a pulse again, and it was right as the EMTs were walking in. I work in nursing homes and most people are DNRs. I've never had to do CPR on anybody. It's crazy. That was my first time, and it was at a fucking hotel and not even work. Then you just so happened to ask this question, lol. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Spookasm for daily videos.